place for everyone to live, the car is at the center of that so often in so many ways.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what we touch on in the podcast over and over and over again. It turns out there's like an endless supply of, if you're focusing on a critique of car culture and how cars wreck cities, there seems not to be an end of the topics you can touch on.
I mean, I've been joking about how my ideal audience member for the podcast is my mother-in-law, who lives in suburban Chicago and drives everywhere. So, my ideal audience member isn't me. It isn't Aaron. It isn't Sarah. It isn't probably a lot of the people who might even be watching us right now who are really into this topic. It's the people who haven't really given much thought to how much space their car takes up in a city, or how much space cars in general take up in a city. And like Aaron was saying, all the ways in which every problem you can think of can somehow be tied back to parking or cars themselves.
Yeah, and that issue of what we like to call car blindness, that people just take cars so much for granted as part of the streetscape and the way of life that there's just no questioning that so we're trying to make people see things the way that we see them, which is that cars are not an inevitability, that cars are not somehow part of the laws of nature, that actually there is life without cars or with fewer cars, and that once you see that that's possible, and once you start seeing everything that cars do, then the car blindness lifts from your eyes and you're able to see that there are other things that are possible.
I guess before we get too far into this topic, I should just say, after the nice introduction that Steve gave, that, really like Steve Vaccaro and the work that he does at Vaccaro and White, for me, that's really been instrumental in lifting the kind of car blindness from my eyes, in a variety of ways over the years. Vaccaro and White, they're the kind of leading law firm in New York City. If you're ever on your bike or you're out walking, and you're God forbid like hit by a car, Vaccaro and White are the people that you call, and they've helped so many New Yorkers and get justice from this system that really doesn't want to give people justice when they're injured or killed by a car. And I've learned a lot from just seeing how these guys do their work and getting into the nitty gritty of just the justice system and how the justice system treats sort of favors automobiles. So
for sure.
Just wanted to say that.
Maybe I'll ask a question to Aaron and Sarah. For the people who've never heard our podcast before, what would you recommend their first episode of the 40 episodes we've done so far?
Wow. Oh man, that's a good question.
Like your favorite one or two episodes.
Well, I think the You Get a Car episode is a really fun episode. It takes a look at the famous Oprah Winfrey car giveaway and talks about how it uses that as an entry point to talk about the way that that people will raise money on GoFundMe. I can't get to work and please help me buy a new car, or buying their coworkers a new car, and how those kinds of approaches don't address the systemic problems. But it's a really fun episode, really one of our lighter and more kind of, I don't know, it's just a fun episode. And then what is it called? The Automotive Police State, Aaron?
Oh yeah, Automotive Police State with Sarah Seo.
Yeah, Sarah Seo, who's a law professor and wrote a tremendous book about how the Fourth Amendment was sort of neutered by automobile culture. That just really is just kind of a mind-blowing interview that Aaron did with her. That's certainly I think one of my favorites. So either one, and that's a more serious serious thing that gets into issues of racial inequity and how an automobile society contributes to just general social inequity and police abuses. And that's a very, really, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to like cross over into to show just how cars affect different parts of life that you might not expect.
Aaron,
So
what about you?
I'll just pick the problem with public meetings. So that was a two-part series we did last fall, which was just, it was insane.
Bonkers.
It was totally nuts. And actually, you get to hear Doug almost get beat up at a public meeting at the very end. So I know, it's a little bit of a spoiler, but
I survived though, so I'm alive. You can tell.
You should see the other guy. See the other guy. They lost. But no, we ended up covering this set of meetings that were kind of like typical bike lash meetings, quote unquote bike lash meetings, where a bunch of people were coming out to a public meeting against a bike project. And the meetings, you really get this sense of just like what the on the ground fight looks like. If you've never been to a community board meeting, or you've never, done bike advocacy or activism, these two episodes of The War on Cars really just put you right in it in a really compelling way. And it's definitely worth a listen if you're trying to understand what it takes to make change in a city. These two episodes give you a sense of that.
So I'll bring up two. One was just mentioned in the chat thread, which I was going to mention. We did an episode. Aaron interviewed a woman by the name of Alex Brooke Lynn, who's a podcast producer herself. And she owns this like 1980 something Cadillac DeVille that she parks on the street in the village. She doesn't really use it to drive anywhere or use it for transportation. She almost kind of uses it as a extra living room from her, small village apartment. Go out there, have a cigarette, talk on the phone. So, that to me got to the heart of what the podcast is about, that we tend to talk about them as transportation tools in the more wonkier parts of our world, but they're really cultural objects. They're pieces of people's identity. And so that's a really fun episode. And Alex is super nice, and she's a really good sport in that episode. So it's really fun. And then the other one I would mention that's really good and kind of also gets to the heart of what our podcast is about is we did an episode last year on the Super Bowl and all of the car ads that are there, where we just sort of analyze what they mean about American society and beyond cars. Because to me, that's what the podcast is about. Like, what is the cultural role of the automobile in America, the world entirely, but certainly America specifically. So those are kind of my two favorites.
So I'll throw out a question to you guys. How do you think this public health crisis that we're in right now is going to change the way New York City treats cyclists, deals with bike infrastructure? What will the effect of the pandemic be on bikes and biking? If you had to speculate or think about it, or even like what are you seeing now?
Can I it's almost as if you knew that I had slides prepared to answer some of
Oh my God. What?
Yeah.
What?
Let me pull up this is going to take a second to get my settings right here. You should all be able to see my, okay. All right. So this is my brief answer, and we've talked about a little of this, so you guys can jump in too. But so I have been taking, we're doing remote schooling. My kids are 10 and 7. And so in the afternoons, after we're done for the day, we've been taking bike rides, mostly to Brooklyn Bridge Park or Red Hook, where it's a little quieter than Prospect Park. And we've just been able to bike on the street, which not everywhere, but for the most part, we've been able to do it, which is not something I would ever do on a weekday after school ends with my kids. So I think hopefully that's something that can be taken forward, that people get a taste of what it's like to bike on streets with people who aren't normally comfortable biking on streets. I think that hopefully we can figure out a way to make that easier and more accessible for everybody. I thought this was pretty cool. We've seen the way like people are trying to remember what 6 feet is to allow that social distancing. And this is from the health department in Minnesota, allows 6 feet of space per person, and they use a bike because bikes are about 5.5 feet long on average. That's pretty good. We talked about this on our latest episode. This is an illustration by Carl Jilg, who's a Swedish illustrator, and it talks about, it represents the ways in which we've just surrendered so much space on our streets to cars and what that means, right? Like if you're in a crosswalk and you're not perfectly balanced, you know, we've all seen those news reports of how the person was hit because they weren't in a crosswalk. You can see the person holding her kid's hand, and if they let go, the kid runs out into the street and is hit. So we talked about the way that this has taken new meaning in the age of coronavirus, right? Like those sidewalks are not wide enough for people to pass each other with 6 feet of clearance. So I think hopefully we'll rethink how much space we've given over to cars, especially on our sidewalks. Yeah, so that's been a big thing. Maybe we'll rethink how we get to work and why we need to commute to work, right? That's been a big thing. You see these jokes are floating around the internet. And I thought this was a great observation just from today, that like runners have become the new cyclists because everybody is out walking when they get the chance. Not because they're going to and from work, because they just want to get some fresh air. And so do runners, and we're all sharing these narrow little sidewalks. And so a lot of ire now is directed away from cyclists who are out in the street, but to runners who are going too fast, too close. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So that's been a big one.
Yeah, I will say that my my wife, who works at 30 Rock, and we live in Brooklyn, and it's about 6.5 miles by the most direct route. Normally when she commutes by bike, she can't even take the most direct route because it's so dangerous. But now she's able to travel the most direct route. And then the last 2 nights she's come home, she travels very late at night. And she says that both times she has not had to put her foot down between 30 Rock and Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, which is kind of incredible. And she's getting home in like 35 minutes. Would normally take 50 minutes. So it's really interesting. And she helped another one of her coworkers ride home, sort of shepherded her because she had never done it before. And so I do think that once people see what it's like to have better routes and faster routes, and I think it's going to change the way some people think. They also were forced to offer bike parking in the building, which they had never done before. They had complied with the law by saying, well, there's this garage nearby where you can put your bike, but now they actually have a bike room in the building because it's so clear that the few employees that do have to be going into work, that they need to have bicycles as a transport option, because a lot of people just are too scared to ride the subway. She gets out at 11 o'clock at night. You're not going to be getting on the subway right now at 11 o'clock at night. It's like when I was growing up in the 80s.
I noticed that in the Q&A, we have a question from Susan from a few minutes back that says, how on earth could de Blasio think the paltry few car-free streets he has opened to pedestrians is anything other than a pittance and a joke? Thoughts?
Is de Blasio even really thinking about this? So that's probably the problem right there. I think the thing, it kind of relates to, Aaron, I think to your earlier question, which is that this crisis has exposed the deficiencies in so much of our public realm. So at a national level, it's exposed the deficiencies in access to healthcare and access to unemployment and basic livable wages. But in the public sphere, on streets, I think it's exposed how little public space we have and how slow most governments, especially in New York, have been at reallocating street space so that everybody has access to a like livable, walkable, bikeable neighborhood, and they don't have to haul themselves to Central Park or to Prospect Park to get some fresh air. And yeah, it's these 1.5 miles of open streets in 4 out of the 5 boroughs. It's nothing.
Do you guys think that his justification was something along the lines of like, you know, we don't really have the personnel, we don't really have the police that we need to close streets to cars and manage this, and you know, it's the sense that like you need all this staff somehow to manage a street without
I think
cars.
That really betrays a very disturbing mindset on the part of the mayor, that people are inherently, people who are walking or something, to be policed, whereas people in cars somehow are not something to be policed. I think he seems to not understand what it is that people do on the street of New York generally. And I think that's because notoriously he does not spend time on the streets of New York himself. I just was watching the other night the wonderful documentary about Ed Koch. And those of you who lived here during the Koch era, I don't know how you feel about him. I did, and I hated him. But the guy liked to stand on the street corner. You know, the guy liked to be on the street, and he knew what it felt like on the street, and he was part of the street. He got that. And with this mayor, there's just a sense that he honestly doesn't even understand what people do when they walk down the. So I guess he thinks that people walking down the street are inherently dangerous. I find that extremely disturbing, and I think it's a real tell on his worldview.
I kind of assume that's actually almost more of an NYPD position. I mean, it's probably his position too, but you know, I would imagine that even if the DOT folks proposed a more ambitious open streets project, the NYPD, who seem to, you know, de facto run the city, probably would have nixed it.
Yeah, I mean, I have an old post on my blog about it relates to when de Blasio and Bill Bratton had floated pulling out the Times Square plazas, because I think they see the streets as governed by order, right? Like when you drive, there are lights and there are signs and there's paint on the street with arrows that tell you which way to go. But when people just gather, you know, or like in Times Square or any plaza, it isn't governed by rules. It's just governed by human nature. And I think that is really hard for the police to understand, that human nature actually can be trusted in most cases. And I think it's, like Sarah said, very hard for someone who never walks to wrap his head around. So he's deferring to the police, like, no, whatever you want, because it doesn't even cross his mind that there's another way.
Just got a really good question in the channel. I'm sorry, Aaron, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead.
Asking, do we have anything to say about Trump comparing the 40,000 traffic deaths to a quote acceptable number of COVID deaths? And that's something that I know we've all been thinking about.
And that wasn't even just Trump. It feels like that was coming up a lot, right? Like this.
It's a big right-wing talking point.
Yeah, major talking point that, you know, hey, this COVID crisis is not. It's, you know, it's no big deal. We accept 40,000 deaths a year, you know, in our cars as a matter of course. So why is everybody making a big deal of this? And I mean, what does that say? It's really interesting. It's like the 40,000 deaths a year that take place in motor vehicles are a kind of baseline of acceptable death for business as usual in America, for something that we just kind of like brush off. And if you think about it, that's more deaths than we had in the Korean War, slightly less deaths than we had in the Vietnam War. It's a September 11th every month, more than that. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the logical response to that, which doesn't usually work when someone is saying something so illogical. Right? The logical response is, okay, first of all, we don't accept that 40,000 people, like the three of us do not accept that 40,000 deaths a year is just the cost of doing business. And de Blasio, for all his faults, has Vision Zero. The city has made some progress in lowering traffic fatalities. They brought the speed limit down. We have not just accepted that this is a fact of life. Lots of cities and places have. But also, like, you know, I can't give a car crash to my family when I come home, right? I can't go to the old folks' home to visit my grandmother in the Bronx and talk to her, and then 3 days later, everyone dies of a car crash. Like, we had 218 people die in traffic crashes in New York City last year. We had 220 people die on Saturday from COVID. So, like, the comparison just doesn't even work for the people who are using it in bad faith, right? Like, we probably wouldn't accept 40,000 traffic fatalities if they all happened in the span of 2 months.
Well, and also I've seen people make the point that one of the reasons that number isn't higher is that we have such excellent trauma hospitals, and that 40,000 deaths could be 50 or 60,000 if we didn't have the hospital capacity to save a lot of lives and turn them into injuries, right? And you know, COVID obviously is taking that away. Now people are driving less too, but if you do have to drive and you get in a car crash now, you might have, in a situation where they might have been able to save you, you might not get saved now.
Get to the back of the line, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, it doesn't work on so many levels, but it's just, I think that the thing that disturbs me the most about that comparison and about the attitude toward people dying of COVID and any number of other things in this country is that this sense that the economy is a thing outside of people that needs to be fed and placated like a wrathful God, and that we're just, we accept that in order for the economy to keep working, people are going to have to suffer and die. And it just is so backwards of what a sort of more organic view of what an economy is. It's a system that allows people to live in community together and have, you know, and eat and have shelter and, you know, have commerce and so forth. The economy serving the people. It's exactly the opposite. It's that we should just be throwing ourselves into a volcano to keep the economy going, and the economy is just some abstraction. So that just drives me insane, not just about COVID, not just about cars, but about a lot of other things.
There's a question in here from Robert Green asking, you know, is the point that we should also focus on driving and transportation safety as we do hygiene now? Which I think is a great question, linking these two issues. And, you know, I was thinking along those lines about how our response to COVID initially, especially here in New York, has been based on personal responsibility. Like, you know, stay 6 feet away from each other, wash your hands when you come home or when you enter a new place. If you cough, go into your elbow. But what we've really seen is that it's the institutional need, larger hospital system, better access to it. We need the government to actually produce masks and things like that. So there's been this really interesting push-pull between institutional responsibility and individual, which I think we see with traffic safety, right? Look both ways before you cross the street. Cyclists should be wearing bright colors and always have lights and things like that, as opposed to, yeah, why don't you get the cars off the street, give me a safe bike lane. And so I think that's a very American thing. Where does the individual responsibility begin and end, and where does the institutional one? And unfortunately in America, we've relied too much perhaps on individual responsibility for the answer to everything.
Yeah, I mean, kind of building on that, I've been thinking a lot about how we're going to come out of this thing, and what, you know, what that's going to mean for the city and for biking. And I guess one of the things that I've noticed over the last 20 years is, like, every few years a new theme emerges that becomes a kind of framework for public policy. So, you know, in the aftermath of September 11th, the framework was kind of all about recovery and rebuilding. And then there was Bloomberg was mayor, and there was a strong business component, economic component to that. And if you wanted to make arguments for bike lanes in 2003, you really had to make this business argument. You had to show how it was going to be good for the economy, right? And then this push for long-term sustainability started. And if you wanted to make a case for biking, you had to make this sustainability argument, this environmental argument. And that lasted for a few years. And then we moved into this realm of like, equity and social justice and Vision Zero. So these like themes, these frameworks for policy, they kind of change every few years. And I think we're clearly going to have a new framework coming out of this catastrophe. And part of it is, again, going to be about recovery. But I think also naturally, I assume it's going to be about public health. And one of the things that's really interesting about biking is that you don't have to be a bullshit artist to make bike advocacy fit into any of these frameworks. I mean, it really works for, biking is good for the economy. Biking is good for, resilience and recovery. Biking is good for public health. But I think, advocates are we're going to have to think about how to make sure that the push for better biking in New York City sort of fits into this recovery and public health framework that is likely to emerge and probably be the focus of the next mayor, I assume. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? I'm being wildly speculative here too. I'm just totally.
Yeah, I mean, my answer on these things changes from day to day as the circumstances change, but I think that's all. I think that's all right. I mean, the best example I can think of is city bike docking patterns have changed from their busiest stations used to be, not surprisingly, Grand Central, Penn Station, Union Square, Lower East Side, things like that. Now they're all near hospitals on First Avenue for the most part. And so we're seeing, much like Sarah was talking about her wife not wanting to take the subway late at night and instead choosing to bike, we're seeing the ways in which cycling is this resilient tool that fits into the public health piece of it in a literal sense of getting doctors to where they need to go. A critical piece of infrastructure in terms of Sarah's wife's case, in terms of information, because she works in a news agency. But then someone asked about
and Doug, therefore probably worthy of public subsidy. Right now we don't subsidize city bike at all. And I think what you're pointing out here is it's serving this vital role of public transit right now. And it doesn't, and yet it's somehow supposed to support itself through a sponsorship from a bank and advertising. That's crazy.
Yeah. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that I think that there are two things that are they seem paradoxically like two sides of the same coin, which is I think people are realizing to a certain extent they do have to take the responsibility for their own individual health, well-being. There's a strong DIY movement kind of springing up in response to this pandemic, because you might have to make your own mask, you might have to figure out how to cook if you don't know how to cook, you might have to improvise all number of things, right? Because you can't just call somebody to come fix something. So there's this self-reliant part of it, but there's also an awareness that none of us can do it by ourselves, and that that the just brutal individualism of American society is just absolutely failing, and it's probably going to be the worst failure, if not, I mean, it's certainly going to be one of the worst failures in the world in response to this crisis, and that collective action is what is called for and necessary, and this thing can't be defeated without collective action. And I think bicycles actually fit really well into that narrative as well, because they do allow personal freedom, and which is something people in America love so much. They do allow you that, but in order to make bicycling really a part of the fabric of the society, we have to have more regard for each other in a collective sense. We have to have streets where people are not just saying, well, I get to drive my 3-ton vehicle down this as fast as I want. I actually, if you're on a bicycle and if you're in this kind of environment where you have to be so conscious of other people and their needs, it's like you have to have a streetscape that's like an ecosystem that is much more it's much more collectivist. It's much more about our collective awareness of each other and our sensitivity to each other. And so I guess the bicycle does all of that, and I hope that there's going to be an ongoing awareness coming out of it.
That's probably a good segue to the question about attitude.
I just, if I could, I'm just going to break in.
Yeah, go.
And just say it's 6:45, and I'm going to suggest that it's 6:55. It would be great for the three of you to start to be able to take questions that people put using the Q&A function. So I'm just breaking in.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions right here, and I think Doug's.
Those are in the chat. Okay, just so you know, the chat is different. That's what I'm saying to you. The Q&A is what everyone else might want to say to you.
Okay.
So I'm going to pose questions that come through the Q&A. So I'm telling people, look at the bottom of your screen, see something that says Q&A, and it will give you a chance to put in a question, and let those questions pile up in there for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll start to answer them.
Good.
Okay, thanks. Signing off.
So I mean, I think, Sarah, your point segues nicely to the question that is posed by the Cycle Club about attitudes toward delivery cyclists. Have they changed? Will they change? Will they continue to change after this is over? Because they are performing an essential service, getting food to people. What do we think?
It's tough. I mean, I hope so. It's like, I mean, there's so many. You're seeing now who the essential workers are in the city, right? And
it's not podcasters.
It's not podcasters.
No.
No, it's like the grocery store clerks and the delivery guys, and the ambulance and the EMT drivers and hospital cleaning staff.
And the bike shops.
And the bike shops, and you gotta hope that somehow we're gonna come out of this with greater respect for the work that's being done there and the people who are doing that work.
I mean, it does seem that finally, after all these years, the mayor, did realize these are essential workers. We've got to not be cracking down on them anymore, and that's been the first step. Because part of I think that the official response, the official line, has not always reflected the way that a lot of New Yorkers feel about delivery cyclists. I mean, yes, there is a vocal minority that objects to them, but I think a lot of people just see them as they're just there, and they don't think about it too much. And now, they probably weren't aware that the police and the mayor were so insistent on cracking down on them. And, so the fact that the official line has changed at all, even temporarily, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that hopefully that's a larger part that we carry with us, which is how many of these rules that we feel were so important and consume so much oxygen in the Safe Streets community are just baloney, basically. The bar at my corner is delivering booze, right? Why is that okay now? I don't I'm glad that it exists, but maybe the rule against it was baloney to begin with. And I think the same thing with the delivery cyclists. Maybe these e-bikes, and I understand a lot of people have problems with them, maybe they're just the best tool for the job in any circumstance. So hopefully that will change. Also, I think hopefully it won't just be attitudes about them will change, but it'll be about what our responsibility is towards them. These people are working pretty dangerous jobs in the best of circumstances, and they get paid nothing. So hopefully we can talk about livable wages, health insurance, unionizing, things like that will protect them beyond just a face mask and gloves.
Yeah, I wonder how much of, people say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. I think there's also sometimes a tendency in a crisis for people to use the crisis to just sort of like reinforce their priors, So it's like, if we're having this conversation, we're like, well, like after this crisis, of course, like, biking, we'll be able to make the case even more for biking. And I'm sure there's someone else in another Zoom somewhere right now saying like, oh, after this crisis, of course, everybody's going to want to have a car.
Yeah.
There's like that conversation is happening in like Eastern Queens or something right now. But I just wonder how we're going to like in practical terms come out of this and really like, I don't know, really make sure that we push the changes into the city that we want to see, that need to happen, that so clearly need to happen coming out of this. Not sure I have an answer to that, but.
I'm going to just jump in. There's a question from Carol Wasser that is, how do you feel about the argument that people shouldn't be cycling now because if they crash, they'll take up a valuable healthcare facility or resources?
I think that I think that speaks to people who probably don't cycle that much, not understanding how safe cycling generally is, especially when you're not around cars. So, what makes cycling dangerous is having to share space with big 3-ton SUVs that can pull into the bike lane or cut you off. I think just the act of going out for a leisurely bike ride is nothing anybody should be worried about at all. I mean, I've been going out almost every day. I'm not like going on crazy rides 100 miles to Bear Mountain or something, but it's a nice way to kind of keep my distance from people, stay sane, get a little exercise. I think that speaks more to preconceived notions about how dangerous cycling is than the actual reality.
I mean, I have to say I've thought about that myself. And partly because I have a teenage son, he's 18, and he's been using the bike to let off steam and go out. And I know because he's 18 and he's big and strong and he can ride really fast, that he's probably out there riding really fast. And there are still cars on the street. And as the situation in the hospitals has gotten more and more extreme, I have to confess, I have discouraged him from going out just for this exact reason. So I think that there is really something to it. I do think that for those of us who are experienced cyclists and have been riding these streets for a long time and who are taking good care, I think it's as safe as a lot of other things. I mean, you can, of course, slip and fall in the shower and need to go to the hospital also. That's another thing that can happen. So I think that that's probably not really a huge threat. But at this point, I'm so determined to stay out of a hospital that I might not take a shower. No, I'm kidding. But I do think that there may be something to that. Although, to your point, Doug, of how safe cycling can be in the right conditions, it reminds me of this Dutch friend that I had knew years ago here in New York, and she asked me sort of confidentially, she said, I noticed that everybody here wears helmets all the time. Are people not very good at riding bikes? Do they fall off?
Do they just tip over every once in a while?
Americans are very clumsy.
Yeah. So I had
very
to
clumsy people.
her. Yeah.
What do you guys? I'm worried about transit and what this whole thing is going to do to transit. There's obviously the loss of revenue and the sort of financial catastrophe that's underway. I feel like that's recoverable. But I can also imagine like a bunch of people when this sort of clears up saying, oh, hey, look, we were going to do congestion charging in Manhattan in New York City before this, but it's not a good time for it now.
Well, that's what they're talking about, that other Zoom conference in Queens right now. Probably.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm very focused on that other conference. And then I also just worry about like people being a little bit afraid to get back on transit, though I can also imagine that being good for biking in some ways. I don't know. What do you guys have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, again, as a lifetime New Yorker of a certain age, I well remember the time when you just didn't go on. so many people I knew did not go on the train. I went on the train. I went on the train at all hours. It was scary as hell. It was filthy. It was dangerous.
What years are you talking here, Sarah?
I'm talking like, so
Summer of 2018.
No, I'm talking about like pretty much like from 1977 to 1990. It like, certainly to go on the train late at night, people would say like, are you kidding? Why are you doing that? And I had many terrifying experiences as a teenager on the trains. So, you know, like we came out of that, like, you know, that people who live here now don't even, you know, up until a few weeks ago, just had no conception of the way that people stigmatized the subway back then. So I think that we can definitely get people back on the subway, partly because the subway is just, you know, talk about the tool for the job. The subway is, for a lot of people, it is the best way to get from my house to 30 Rock quickly. Actually.
Yeah, it's not going to change.
And that's not going to change. And those rails are going to be there. And as long as they can get the money back into it. The congestion pricing thing is another story, though. I think you're right that it's going to be, that there's going to be, it's just like the plastic bag thing. I think people are going to be trying to repeal the plastic bag thing. Like, oh, well,
Right.
see, we need plastic bags because pandemics. You know, they're,
Right.
you know, like everybody's going to, you're right, everybody's going to use it for their agenda. It's too bad that their agendas are bad and ours is good.
That's always the problem.
I think that we talked about this on the podcast in terms of like the goal for a lot of cities. This was, you know, your experience, Sarah, was in Finland, and that the goal shouldn't necessarily to be focused on livability or sustainability, but just functionality to make a functioning city. And I think that if we can come out of this and say, okay, how can we make this city function better so that trains aren't crowded? Well, run more trains, give people a bus line on top of the train line or adjacent to it so that they have options. I mean, that's the other thing, is that for some people, getting back on the train won't be a choice. Certainly if you're lower income, we're seeing right now scenes of crowded trains because those people don't have a choice to stay at home, or maybe they can't afford a bike or a city bike membership. So I think it's really just going to depend on who we're talking about. I do think there's a real opportunity that will unfortunately be missed by cities to build out the bike lane network so that as people are a little uneasy about getting on the train, they have options, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, I'm just going to go to a question that's been posed here. Someone who's been stuck with foot surgery in their home, and they're not exactly sure what they can expect or anticipate when they're out on the street. And so Jack DePagter is asking what conditions should he anticipate when he starts riding again tomorrow? So the question is, what is it like to ride out on the streets now? And I'll combine it with another question that was posed earlier, perhaps sarcastic. Exactly how many police have been assigned to the tiny pop-up bike lanes that were erected on Smith Street and at the mouth of the Queens Midtown Tunnel by Mayor de Blasio, since wherever people are out in public nowadays with the virus, we need police protection. Do we have police protection in those areas?
I just went for a ride this afternoon from my home in Park Slope over the Manhattan Bridge into up Christie Street a little bit. So I took the new bike lane on Smith Street. It's just traffic cones, barrels, and there were no police there. I think the police have been assigned to all the little open streets things that are happening. Streets Blog reported there were something like 20 to 30 cops at one stretch of them, which is complete overkill. I think if you're not used to what's been going on there, and I'm sure some of the people watching can attest to this, you do have to be mindful that for every very pleasant, quiet street to bike on, you'll get like the one or two just frankly asshole-ish drivers who are speeding like crazy because they can, because the streets are wide open. And I'm getting to intersections and I am not taking for granted that drivers will stop for red lights, which is a good strategy in general, but seems like more necessary right now.
Yeah, and somebody earlier had asked about how what's happening in New York for the bike lanes compares to other cities. And I will say that I've heard that same complaint from other cities. I mean, I don't have really good, detailed, reliable information about every modification that's been made in every city to create more bike lanes. I know that that's been happening, but I have heard from people around the country that drivers are driving really fast on these streets. And so I think that's something to really be mindful of.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask a different question that I saw being addressed. There's a lot of shaming going on now. People who wear masks, but who are out just doing ordinary errands are being shamed. Why are you using a mask? That mask should be given to a healthcare provider who needs it. People who are out not seemingly doing something essential, like not delivering your food on an e-bike, but instead just walking around or maybe biking around. Aren't you creating a risk of contagion, and shouldn't you just stay home as we're all being told to do? And I saw a bunch of people jump down one person's throat for mask shaming. And I thought to myself, isn't it just like when I say to someone, you know, get the hell out of the bike lane? You know, I'm telling someone in their car, they pull in their car into the bike lane. And this woman was saying, what is someone doing here with a mask in the grocery store? That mask should go to a healthcare provider. I mean, to me, it's that we're all being forced to rethink some questions about how you strike that balance between individual rights and collective rights. And I think as cyclists, we're so used to not having our rights respected on the road. And we've been speaking up and people just view us as a cranky minority. But now, like, everyone is out there policing everyone's individual behavior because of the risks and the dangers that it creates. How do you change people's attitudes if assuming this virus thing isn't going to last forever? I mean, how do you carry forward into people's thinking and self-conception and mindset and manner of comporting themselves in public some greater mindfulness for the impact of their behavior on other people, the dangers that their thoughtless behavior can cause on other people? Or are we really just going to go back to where we were?
I mean, I think about this all the time, especially after I was in Japan a year and a half ago, and heard people talking there about, you know, you conduct yourself 49% for yourself and 51% for other people. And that, to me, I keep thinking about that all the time. And I guess part of what I think is that the United States is a very, very young nation, and we have a relatively unevolved society. And a place like Japan has, you know, been trying to figure out what society should be like for a lot longer. And I don't know.
On a tiny island, no less. Like, they really have to share this place, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. Like, is this going to be one of those events that actually shapes our national character and changes things about our national character? Is this just part of that sort of that testing of our mettle, or trying us in the crucible of history, or whatever it is, that is going to actually change the way that people think about collective action? I mean, World War II got us some of the way there. And then we kind of backslid a lot. I don't know. Like, I think it potentially could have a huge effect, or we could just go, you know, really hard the other way. And that's the question, you know. And as far as masks, I will say that I found an N95 mask in my basement from a painting project, and I've been wearing it. And like, I am suffering so many, like, you know, feelings about, like, I wish I could put a little sign on it that says, like, was previously used when I was painting, and so I can't give it to a healthcare worker anyway. And like, I'm making cloth masks now that are clearly homemade, so that I'll be able to wear a mask in public, which I think is the responsible thing to do. And people won't shame me. So I don't know.
I think it gets to what I was saying before about that, like, balance between individual responsibility and like Steve was saying, collective action, and where does one begin and where does one end? And, you know, so there's new guidelines now basically saying, gee, maybe everybody should be wearing a mask, and maybe everybody should have been wearing a mask as they were in other countries. But the question is, what does an individual do with that information when, as Sarah is suggesting and saying, the hospitals need all the masks. So if I happen to find some at a store and buy them, shouldn't I give them to the hospital? Yeah, I probably should. But then if I wear one and I don't get sick, I don't become a burden on that same hospital that is in desperate need of equipment. And so wouldn't that also be better? So again, like all of these things are just being thrust upon us as individuals, and it's taking our eyes off of the larger societal failures. I think it's really, really similar to when you hear a report of a cyclist fatality and everyone jumps in the comments section, oh, well, she wasn't wearing a helmet. It's like, yeah, that's like not, that might not have actually helped in that case on a street where like cement trucks are driving all the time. And we just throw it down to the individual and don't want to have the larger conversation about what it would mean for us to live in a society where I got a mask and all the doctors got a mask, because that's the real answer.
Here's another.
I'll just throw in one more comment too. I mean, I guess I feel like we've come out of these big crises in the past, like World War I. We come out of World War I and the Spanish flu, and we have the Roaring '20s. You know, we have just like, let's drink booze and dance and be flappers and you know, have the Weimar Republic and go crazy. We come out of World War II and we go into this like binge of consumption and sprawl building, and Americans do have this tendency to you know, get kind of like we did this, we had this big crisis, and now let's just like live it up for a while. At the same, so I could see us going in that direction. But at the same time, I think what's happening in this particular crisis is so clearly that the places that believe in government, that have effective government, that are like well-managed cities and states, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei, Japan, and China to some extent seem to have their act together. These places are Seoul, South Korea. They're doing so much better than we are. They're going to come out of this so much better. I think a really strong case for better collective action, better governance, more, you know, leadership that really just thinks holistically about how to manage a city well. There's going to be a strong case for that too. So it could go either way.
Absolutely. I'm going to riff off of a comment in the chat that I saw Hal make, but turn it into something more of a question on the other side of this issue. For, you know, are we individuals going to learn to be less individualistic and think more about the collective? Well, for a lot of people on this chat, they believe in daily, regular exercise. For a lot of people who are listening to this program, they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, older. They engage in vigorous exercise, certainly weekly, perhaps daily, and they're actually much better positioned to survive this coronavirus pandemic than a lot of other people out there who may be suffering from so-called underlying conditions, which often are associated with sedentary lifestyles, yeah, and obesity. And, you know, how can we, if we believe in this and we believe it's a good thing and it makes us feel a little bit better prepared to handle this pandemic, how can we, in a way that doesn't make us look like coming off like some, you know, like, I've got my lifeboat, you know, you should have been doing laps all those years, sorry. How do we try to promote the idea of fitness as being, you know, something that is part of, you know, the good life in the post-coronavirus
I don't think
world?
you're going to have to do much to promote it at all. There's been a mini running boom, right? Like people are going out, jogging is a thing now again. You know, it's jogging was what it was in the 70s and 80s, and then it became running, and now it's jogging again. I also run, and I've run the New York City Marathon and the Chicago Marathon, and there's this theory, and people who are runners probably know this, that the running booms that have happened usually came at times of high stress and anxiety in our country. So the first running boom is like the early 1970s, Nixon era Watergate. The more recent running booms were post 2016 after Trump is elected. And anyone who tried to enter the Brooklyn Half or any of those races knows how hard it's been to do that because of the surge in running. And now you're seeing another one. So I think cycling is just going to take off on its own. People are going to say, oh, gee, physical fitness is important. Physical fitness I can do by myself or with a group is really important. So I don't think we're going to have to do much to promote the physical health aspect of this.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back a little bit on that because
Sure.
I have an underlying condition, which is that I am somewhat asthmatic. I used to be really asthmatic when I was a kid. Why? It's probably because I grew up in an apartment building on 2nd Avenue and 64th Street and inhaled the fumes of the cars going to the Queensboro Bridge for the first several years of my life. And, you know, again, we get to this issue of the systemic problems. Air pollution is one of my, you know, things that it's actually a really big contributing factor to this health crisis that we're going through right now in ways that are going to only become more apparent as more research is done. But, you know, like you can't bicycle your way out of asthma if you're living in a place where there are just auto fumes coming piped into your bedroom at night. So, and for a lot of people and a lot of places in the country, it's impossible to even go out for a run because you go out and there's an arterial road right there and you can't, you know, so, I mean, again, I think that's a privileged position to take, that we have that much control over our health. So much of it is just is determined by our environment. Now, that's what we really need is, you know, a government and a society that recognize that being able to take care of your own health is a value, and that you give people the places and the resources they need to do that. Maybe we'll get that, but I do think that it's not quite that easy.
Oh, for
I mean,
sure.
one of the kind of hopeful things that's happening right now is that, you know, as sort of economy stops during this crisis, you're seeing places like San Francisco Bay Area and LA, the air quality in these places that suffer really terrible car smog has gotten so good. I have a buddy in LA who's emailing me pictures every day about how beautiful the air is in Los Angeles right now.
Yeah.
And you know, you got to hope that like people are seeing this and feeling this and will come out of this saying, you know what, that's something that we want to continue, and we could possibly get momentum for a phase out of gas burning cars out of this thing.
Yeah,
but it's not going to happen on its own. People are going to really have to push it, you know.
You know, the Trump administration just today.
Yeah, they're going the opposite direction.
Right.
The fuel emission standards. So anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need more than 10 minutes to do the raffle and wrap up. We have some awesome prizes. So that leaves 7 minutes. And anyone who has any questions they haven't asked can ask them. I invite you to ask them. And anyone who doesn't, I'm just going to say I knew Aaron and Doug in many different formats or places or contexts, and one of them was that we served together as board members of Streets PAC. And we got involved in the municipal elections where Bill de Blasio was installed and is now riding out his second term from the momentum of that first, I think, really not much else. This is not obviously an electoral platform because this is a nonprofit organization, but I'm just wondering if you could, I mean, there were some remarks about Bill de Blasio sort of not getting things. Have you seen any of our elected officials kind of stepping up and speaking about this stuff in a way you think is good and right and helpful? We'll leave, I don't know, I was going to say leave Andrew Cuomo out of it, but you don't have to, you know, whatever you think, who we should be listening to or looking at during this time, during this pandemic, who seems to be fulfilling the role government should be in the circumstance when there's lives at stake and there's essentially chaos and upheaval.
Well, for our issues, I think Corey Johnson and Scott Stringer have been doing a good job of communicating what's needed. They were both out early with calls to shut things down. They are probably, if you look online today, I think Scott was talking about, we need to close the playgrounds, but he's also been very sensitive to the need to replace that with better open space elsewhere. Corey was the one calling for temporary bike lanes and expanded pedestrian space really early. He's been great. Carlina Rivera, who I know is a Streets PAC endorsee, she was really good at calling for some of that stuff. So, I think there are a lot of people Mark Levine on the Upper West Side.
I was going to say Mark Levine has been so impressive and chairing. He's a city council member who chairs the health committee. Antonio Reynoso has been really, I haven't seen him specifically on this particular crisis, but in general, he's been so good with issues related to biking and streets and the environment, reforming the entire sanitation industry. He's been fantastic.
Yeah.
We got one more question, which was, I saw this report too, and I was scratching my head about it because it purported to be a report from the early pre-lockdown days, but as you recall, people were being told to stay in for a period of time before the 21st, when the lockdown order became effective. People were being told that their businesses should have less than all the people go in. Certainly our law firm went and we went to a skeleton crew, and really it was just my partner and I going in, and our employees are working remotely. And from that period of time, I guess early March, there was this report in Streets blog of a big uptick in cyclist and pedestrian injuries. It made intuitive sense to me because of the phenomenon Doug mentioned, which is that you can go much faster now, and the cops aren't really watching, and drivers know that. But it also struck me as kind of surprising that there would be a quick rollout of statistics that were unfavorable to the government in such a quick turnaround period of time on an issue that we care about, which never happens. The report just said that the police admitted it. And do you have any information to offer, any of you, about whether or not that report was credible or true?
I feel like this is we should be asking you this.
Yeah, I guess, right? Yeah, I was going to say, we're not the epidemiologists or crash statisticians. So I had seen that crashes were up something, like 43%, right? That's what it was. But I guess the question was, what was the overall rate of cycling? Because that went up as well. So, did that outpace the growth in injuries? If so, not to be dismissive of a 43% rise in injuries, but maybe it wasn't as dire and bad as that statistic might sound. I would need more information. A very good question for Streets blog.
Yeah, I didn't see like the really hard numbers underlying that. One thing that I did think of was that there are probably some people getting on bikes who haven't been on bikes in a while as well. And as we all know in this group, riding the streets of New York is no joke, not just because of the cars, but because of the condition of the pavement is really substandard, and there's a lot of it's a challenging environment to ride in. So that was one of the things that I thought of as a possible explanation.
Okay, so there's been some interesting discussion going on in the chat. All of you can feel free to take a look at it, but I'm going to ask you to just hold on for a few minutes more while we wrap up with our raffle. It's a traditional part of the meeting. I suppose it's somewhat manipulative to keep people sticking around, and so that they hope that they can win. Tonight's meeting was sponsored by our law firm. Oh, and now you're leaving?
No, I'm getting something. I have a prop.
The Law Office of Vaccaro and White. And the gifts that we are sponsoring that you could win are 4 different things. 3 of one thing, which is a merchandise sort of goodie bag from the War on Cars. You can get their very awesome t-shirt. Doug has it. I've got an earlier version here, along with some of their very cool stickers, which if you like putting stickers on your bike, I know not many people in the club like to, but if you're into that kind of thing, it's awesome. I do it. And then the fourth prize, which you might consider somewhat more valuable, I don't know, is a $100 gift certificate to Connolly's, which I purchased from them because we're not having our monthly meetings there anymore. They're shut down. They're not making any money. I actually spoke to the person, you know, the woman who owns it. It's a family business, and they're having a rough go of it. So I thought it would be nice to get a gift certificate. If you win, obviously only redeemable once they open again. So if you win, you got to keep your fingers crossed. You can go out and enjoy that $100 there. Now, how to conduct a raffle virtually. I figured it out. Share screen, and now I'm going to show you. I've got all of the registrants here in the spreadsheet that I took out of the webinar, numbered. We ended up with 1 through 104, okay? And now, what number should I pick for the raffle? Well, that's easy too, because there's such a thing as a random number generator.
Yes, indeedy.
Here goes. 3. Who is number 3? You have to be here to win.
Jonovs@me.com.
Okay, Maris Jonovs.
Oh, man.
Is Maris Jonovs here? Speak up in the chat. I can't have the chat at the same time that I'm looking at.
I don't see Maris piping up in the chat.
Okay, we're gonna have to just do this again. Okay, generate 6. That doesn't seem so random, but honestly, I tested it before. T. Shepherd Ota. Toshi Shepherd Ota. Showing up in the chat?
No.
It's your big chance, T. Shepherd Ota. Well,
Right now.
we're just gonna keep going.
Random number generator is going to be 9 now.
I'm gonna just, oh, I see the problem. It's max 1 through 10. Okay, sorry.
This thing was rigged.
This thing is rigged.
46.
I smell a lawsuit here.
That's more like it. Jack DePagter, I know he's here because he asked a question. Jack DePagter is getting a package of merchandise from the War on Cars.
So
You're
Steve,
still here, right, Jack? I wish it wasn't so hard to shift back and forth between.
Yes, there he is.
Rigged. Congratulations.
Okay, you guys are going to let me know.
You, baby.
You guys are going to let me know. Okay, next one. 63. Naoko Aoki. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Naoko Aoki. Speak up. Use your chat function or forever be silent.
Peter Sherman Crosby's there.
Yes, we can see your chats, Peter.
Okay, going again to 44. 44, oh my God. Now they were really in lawsuit territory. Holly Campbell. Is Holly still on the line?
I see her on the list of panelists, of attendees.
Attendees, she's on the list, but is she there? And can she?
Yeah, there she is.
Okay, Holly Campbell.
This is rife with corruption.
Exactly. Well, Holly actually often wins these raffles even when they're done in person. So why should it be any different now?
Some people are just lucky.
Okay. Back to this for the third goodie bag from the War on Cars. 87. Susan Rodetis. Susan.
She's on the list.
She's on the list. I know. I saw her there.
She had a question before too.
Oh, okay. Is she just having some difficulty getting to the chat function, or did she leave us and forfeit? Is she showing up in chat?
Nope.
Susan.
Oh, that's Aaron.
Susan, I'm sorry. I know how much you wanted that t-shirt. 89. Wow.
Or Susan, she's probably just in the bathroom or something.
Okay, Hank Schiffman. Hank. Maybe some people don't want the
Maybe
t-shirt.
we've just been doing like a chat, like there's been no one here the whole time.
Yeah.
Hank.
Steve, are these all bots on the list? How do we know?
I took it from the people who registered, not the people who necessarily came in.
Just kidding.
24. It's all right. We'll get this done by the end of the program. 24. Mark Simkin. I bet Mark's on. Mark is on our board. I saw him making comments earlier, I think. Mark?
Right. Oh, wait. No.
Going once for Mark Simkin.
He's on that list, so,
Going twice. No, we don't do it unless people stick around. You get the...
There he is.
Mark.
Oh, he's
Kirby, you can give the prize
He's
to somebody.
generously offering to give the prize to somebody else. Thank you, Mark. That's super nice.
Okay. Whoever speaks up first on the chat gets Mark's prize.
Whoa.
Oh,
I'm going on to the final gift, which is...
Lucia Day.
Who's that?
And
Lucia.
K-Cal.
Lucia, number 25.
Rusha?
Lucia
Yeah.
Den.
Okay.
She was first in there.
Okay, so now this is for the big prize. Are you ready? Number 70 for the $100 gift certificate. Daniel Hausdorff.
You ready?
Daniel Hausdorff online.
It says he's an attendee.
It,
Come on, Daniel.
Daniel Hausdorff.
Click on chat. Type in your message.
Just say hello, I'm here.
Oh,
Yay, Daniel. All right.
Okay.
So, Steve, you will send me everybody's contact information. I can get their T-shirt sizes and addresses, and I will mail them out, provided the post office is still functioning by the time I get all of that stuff. I'm happy to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll put in a pitch. If you didn't win and you'd like a T-shirt, you can become a Patreon supporter of the War on Cars. That's how we produce the podcast and pay for our production costs. You can go to patreon.com, the War on Cars pod, or our website, thewaroncars.org.
I just put it in this chat channel.
Yes.
Guys. The link is
Yeah,
right
and
there.
also I want to put in another plug for the law offices of
Yes.
White, because
They're great.
they have
Awesome.
been like such faithful supporters of ours, and it's just they
From
were
the
like
beginning.
our first really major supporters, and really got us going at a time when we didn't have any idea whether this thing was going to turn into anything. And we're coming up on 2 years now of putting out the podcast, and it's become a real thing, and that's a lot because of the support that Vaccaro and White have given to us, because they're awesome.
Thank you. It's really our pleasure.
Absolutely.
And
I agree.
you know, it was great to be able to pull this together. I just want to say before we end the webinar in just a minute or two that there is another one coming up in just 1 week at 6:30 Tuesday evening with Dr. Ian Smith, who is a researcher at the University of Bath. He's an amazing guy. He has done research that has been widely accepted on driver passing behavior as to cyclists based on how the cyclist is dressed, whether it's an apparent male or female cyclist, whether the cyclist has a helmet. A lot of other research on passing behavior by motorists that has been published in peer-reviewed journals and is fascinating. He also is a champion ultra-distance racer who holds the world record for traversing Europe in a north-south direction from the Straits of Gibraltar all the way up to the very northernmost reaches of Finland, and a bunch of other rides. And it's amazing to hear him tell what it's like doing those rides, pretty much unsupported, alone, out on the road. Like everyone here on this webinar, he's involved in trying to promote cycling and support it and spread it. And he is there in the UK on lockdown because of coronavirus, just like all of us, and he has some very interesting thoughts to share about what it's like there. So he's going to join us next week at 6:30, and hopefully by then, technologically we'll be handling Zoom much better, and we'll have a more pleasing and interactive experience for everyone who signs up. So until then, thanks very much, and take care. Be safe.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
It was fun.